Okay, so yeah, so what I'm presenting, that's what it's called, Thinking as Human Beings with Stebbing, Macdonald, Emmet, Murdoch, and MIdgley. Um, and okay, just to give you a sense of what I'm up to. Um, so this is a piece of work which hopefully will be part of a monograph, which is provisionally titled Thinking as Human Beings, Women and the Story of 20th Century Philosophy. Although, if you have thoughts on that, that would be welcome. And the book has three aims. So the first of them is simply to tell the stories of three, what I'm calling first gen or first generation women in analytic philosophy. And you can probably guess that I'm sort of taking as a given that the quartet are sort of second gen. And the second aim is to examine what the story of 20th century British philosophy or analytic philosophy looks like with these protagonists. And you may have noticed that I'm using the word story quite a lot, and that's connected to the third aim. So I guess in writing the book, I'm trying to sort of make a historiographical or meta-philosophical point about the role of stories in the history of philosophy. So I guess without going into too much detail, the idea that I'm trying to get across is that when we're doing history of philosophy, we are inevitably telling a particular story, and there will always be alternative stories that might be told. And it's important, I guess, to think about why we tell certain stories or why certain stories have been told and not others, typically. So broadly, that's what's going on. The protagonists of my story are these three women. Susan Stebbing, Britain's first woman to be a professor of philosophy. Margaret Macdonald, who was her student and later with Stebbing founded the journal Analysis. And Dorothy Emmet, who was the second woman in Britain to be a philosophy professor, but like Stebbing, at the time, the only woman in Britain to be a philosophy professor because Stebbing had already died. So those are the figures that I'm interested in, although they're not the only figures I'm interested in, but those are the kind of main characters of the story that I am telling. Okay, and what I'm going to present to you is actually the final chapter, or what I think will be the final chapter of the book. And just to give you some background to this chapter, I guess it's in this chapter where I sort of really follow through with the idea behind the book's title, which is Thinking as Human Beings. It's also the part of the book where I begin to kind of try and tell a slightly wider story, or if you like, join up the dots between this story and other stories, particularly the stories that are very well told in Metaphysical Animals and The Women Are Up to Something about the quartet. So it's an attempt to kind of bridge the gap to some degree between the first generation of women in British analytic philosophy and the second generation. So if you like, the story that I'm telling is the story of what the women were up to before they were up to something, to borrow Benjamin Lipscomb's word. One thing that might be just worth clarifying is I'm not super interested in kind of establishing any influence claims, right? I'm not sort of trying to say that Murdoch and MIdgley and Foote and Anscombe were heavily influenced by Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet. I think there is scope for some of that. So when I was in Cambridge recently looking at Dorothy Emmet's address books, MIdgley and Murdoch were in there, their phone numbers and their addresses. So she did seem to know them. But that's kind of not really my primary aim. And the chapter and the talk that I'll give or am giving focuses on the following type of questions. What does thinking philosophically involve? What ought it to involve? And what are good philosophers and how do they operate? So I guess the kind of topic that I'm interested in is philosophical inquiry itself. And if you like, the kind of visions of philosophical inquiry or what philosophy can do or where the value of philosophy lies that are presented to us, in this case, by Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet and MIdgley and Murdoch. And loosely speaking, the kind of aim of this chapter is to establish that Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet and Murdoch and Midgley's views can all be thought of as clustering around the following kinds of answer to those questions. So I think these quotes from Stebbing on the one hand and Midgley on the other are kind of encapsulate the kind of vision of philosophical inquiry that I think comes out of the work of all of these figures. I don't think that they're presenting a completely unified vision. I don't want to establish that there's, a big school of philosophers that constituted by these figures. I don't even want to establish that Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet should be thought of as a school or a tradition. But I do think that there's a kind of, if you like, undercurrent of this alternative way of thinking about philosophical inquiry. So Stebbing's words, which I'll come back to, it is we need to remember persons who think, not purely rational spirits. And this is about 60 years later, but I think strikingly similar in Midgley's philosophical plumbing. We think as whole people, not as disembodied minds, not as computers. Okay. I was just looking back at some of the stuff I'd written, and I just thought I'm just going to read out a part of what I've written in this chapter, just to give you a sense of where I'm going with all this, and then I'll jump into it. Okay, when these five philosophers are considered in relation to one another, I try to show what emerges is an approach to philosophy and philosophizing that diverges from a traditional view that can be traced through much of Western philosophy's history. That philosophical inquiry involves thinking as a purely rational being. Given that, I will conclude this chapter and this book by suggesting that if we pay more attention to women in 20th century British philosophy, then what emerges is not just a different story of what views philosophers held during this period, but a very different conception of philosophy itself. It might sound obvious, trivial even, to note that it is people, real people, human beings, who engage in philosophical thinking. And yet for all these women, this was an insight that captured something essential about the nature of philosophy and its relation to real life, and articulated something that was drastically wrong with much of the professionalized academic philosophy that was taking place around them. Okay. That's all kind of bigger picture stuff. Here's the overview of what I'm going to do, I guess, in the next half an hour or so. So the first thing I want to do is introduce you to something that I'm calling the austere conception of philosophical inquiry. So this is the approach to philosophizing, which I think is deeply rooted in the history of Western philosophy. And I'll give you some examples. And I'll give you a specific example, which is most relevant to the work of the figures that I'm interested in. And I'll come back to this, but I think that there's a descriptive element to this view and there's a normative element. So there's a claim about what philosophy is, and there's a claim about what philosophy ought to be. Then I'm going to run through Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet and their approaches to philosophizing and their response to this austere conception of philosophical inquiry. I don't really know why their image is a pair of champagne glasses. It's just what PowerPoint offered me, but I quite like it. And then I'm going to talk about Murdoch and MIdgley, and that's where I'm going to start to, I hope, tell a wider story of these figures across the 20th century. Okay. why did this quote that it is persons that think, not purely rational spirits, that's from Thinking to Some Purpose, published in 1939. Why did Stebbing need to remind readers of Thinking to Some Purpose that it is persons that think, not purely rational spirits? And I think the answer is because, as I was saying, there's a deep-seated approach to philosophical inquiry that runs through the history of Western philosophy. So bear with me because I'm going to give a kind of potted account of these thinkers here. But if you go back to the Republic, if you go back to Plato's allegory of the cave, what you get is the idea that ordinary life is comparable to the cave dwellers who look at the shadows on the cave and think that they're, really seeing how things are. And the philosopher is like somebody who's managed to escape from the cave, out into the real world and bring back knowledge of what things are really like. So in the cave allegory, there's this idea that being a philosopher means kind of escaping the shackles of ordinary life. It means sort of transcending the conditions in which, the rest of the world is living and doing something different. In the Meditations, I literally just came from a class teaching the Meditations. Descartes famously argues that what we are is not our bodies, right? Our senses are not to be trusted, and we need to turn away from our senses. And that what we are when, we are thinking things, right? But a thinking thing is, in the words of Descartes, really distinct from the body and the rest of the material world, right? The thinking thing is something spiritual, rational, immaterial, again, detached from or transcendent of ordinary life and our status as a human being, right? In Kant's Ethics, I think when Stebbing uses this phrase, purely rational spirits, it's something like, someone like Kant that she has in mind as a foil to her own view. So Kant's view that in order to be a good moral agent, you need to consider how a rational being would approach a given moral dilemma, or what kind of moral maxim a rational being would follow, right? If you do something because it's in your nature to do so, or because it's what you desire, or, in your character, you're not really operating as a moral agent, right? If there are Kant or Descartes or Plato scholars in the chat, apologies. But the idea in all those views is that thinking philosophically is about transcending or separating oneself or abstracting oneself from the conditions of real life, right? Your status as a human being. So the austere view is a view that says that when we engage in philosophical inquiry, we ought to detach ourselves from the senses and our bodies, separate ourselves from our lives, experiences, education, desires, needs, temperaments, in short, our humanity. That we ought to think as thinking things or rational beings, or if you like, strive for a view from nowhere. So for proponents of the austere view, you've got philosophers on the one hand and human beings on the other. Or at the very least, you've got thinking philosophically and thinking as a human being. And those are different things. Okay. There's Bertrand Russell, looking quite austere himself. In the 20th century, this kind of austere conception of philosophical inquiry is very clearly laid out in Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, right? So he's a really useful representative of this traditional approach to philosophizing. So according to Russell, philosophy's value lies in the greatness of the objects which it contemplates and the freedom from narrow and personal aims resulting from this contemplation, right? So by thinking philosophically, you're freeing yourself from your own personal context. And Russell explains that a free intellect will, as he puts it, see as God might see, without a here and a now, without hopes and fears, without the trammels of customary beliefs and traditional prejudices, calmly, dispassionately, in the sole and exclusive desire for knowledge. Knowledge as impersonal, as purely contemplative as it is possible for man to attain. Right? Again, it's about taking up a God's eye perspective on things, a pure, objective, rational approach to whatever particular problem one might be engaging with. A free intellect will also value more the abstract and universal knowledge into which the accidents of private history do not enter. So you kind of leave your own personality and past at the door when you enter the realm of philosophy. Then the knowledge brought by the senses, and dependent as such knowledge must be upon an exclusive and personal point of view, and a body whose sense organs distort as much as they reveal, right? So there's a kind of Cartesian element to this too, that the senses and the body are deceptive. So I take it that Russell is describing his perfect philosophical thinker, right? A free intellect, a rational being who has transcended their human status, jettisoned the baggage of the body and the past and education and history and personality, jettisoned the senses and any purely private or personal matters. I mean, I can say more about this, but I'm just going to be very brief here. I think the austere view is there playing a role in a lot of 20th century thought, I guess in Britain particularly, right? So it's there in the logical positivism of A.J. Ayer and others. It's there in the emergence of the analytic method, Russell and Moore. And I think later in the century, it's there in, for example, the scientism of people like Richard Dawkins. The kind of reductive, physicalist tendencies of the second half of the 20th century are connected to this austere approach to philosophical inquiry, or just inquiry in general. And as Claire and Rachel, explain very well, it's this kind of view, I think, that the quartet respond to with a joint no, right? Okay, but before we get to the quartet or members of the quartet, how do Stebbing, Macdonald, and Emmet respond to this? I think there's and I think this is important, this distinction I'm about to draw, or at least helpful. There's two interpretations of the austere view, right? So it can be read as a descriptive claim, a description of what philosophers do, or maybe a descriptive claim of what makes it the case that you are or are not doing proper philosophy. It can also be read as a normative claim, right? Maybe an ideal to strive for, a claim about what philosophers ought to do. It might be both, but it could also just be one of those, right? I don't think they necessarily come hand in hand, right? So for example, maybe Russell thought that philosophers ought to see as God might, but in reality fail to do so, for example. And what I'm going to do as I run through Stebbing, Macdonald, Emmet, MIdgley, and Murdoch is think about how they respond to both components of the austere view. But to begin with, I think what is clear, or what hopefully will look a little clearer in about 15 minutes time, is that Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet reject both interpretations. Okay, starting with Stebbing. Well, I began with this quote from Thinking to Some Purpose, this quote that says, we need to remember persons that think, not purely rational spirits. And that seems to me like a clear rejection of the descriptive reading of the austere view, right? It just is not rational spirits that do the thinking. It's people. What about the normative reading? I think Stebbing is probably clearest about this in her final two works, which are both broadly construed on ethics or moral philosophy. Ideals and Illusions from 1941 and Men and Moral Principles from, that should say 1943, not 1934. So in Men and Moral Principles, Stebbing takes a look around her, takes stock of the moral philosophy that's going on around her, and in response to that says this: certain contemporary philosophers seem contented to regard moral philosophy only as providing occasions for ethical remarks, and are interested in these remarks only insofar as they provide exercises in linguistic analysis. These exercises, treated as games requiring no small degree of specialized skill, are like chess problems to an ardent chess player, inexhaustibly amusing, but of no practical concern in the business of living. And Stebbing really thinks that as moral philosophers, what we should be interested in is the business of living. So she kind of, and I can say more about this if people are interested, but she is very critical of kind of paradigmatic moral philosophy, and says that instead of what moral philosophers are doing, moral philosophers, she writes, must be concerned with the ways in which men live, their ways of life which embody their ideals. I conceive that it falls within the proper province of moral philosophy, sorry, there's some typos here, to formulate ideals worth living for and to attempt to make clear principles which may afford guides for action. And this is very clear, right? To think in abstractions when one's concern is moral philosophy, according to Stebbing, is to fail as a philosopher. Okay. I appreciate people may want to know more about each of the views that I'm putting forward here, but I'm going to kind of run through them. But please do let me know if there's anything that I can talk about more later. What about Macdonald? So Macdonald has this really interesting paper from 1953 called Linguistic Philosophy and Perception. And she describes herself in that paper as engaging in what she calls second level or meta-philosophical reflection, which I think is, you can think of as basically a kind of anthropology. So Macdonald sort of takes herself to sort of step back and look around and look at what philosophers are doing and think like, what are they up to? And basically presents her findings in that paper. And one of her findings is that temperament has much to do with which philosophical theories we are and are not attracted to. She also describes philosophical theories as working in a similar way to a good story, right? So a good philosophical theory will portray a particular way of seeing things in a particularly compelling way, just like a good story. On the descriptive version of the austere view, Macdonald is pretty unequivocal that it's just not accurate. This idea that we think or could possibly think in a purely rational, objective, impartial way. So she imagines an imaginary interlocutor reading her paper. I mean, you can sort of imagine Russell reading her paper and responding with this: but ought not philosophy to be impersonal, unemotional, and strictly rational? Her reply is, it isn't, and that cannot be ignored by a meta-philosopher. So I think she's pretty clear on, it's pretty clear what her response to the descriptive reading of the austere view would be. What about the normative idea that we ought to try and strive to be objective, impartial, see as God might see? Macdonald takes issue in this paper with a view that she attributes to logical positivism, which is the view that philosophy is a kind of science, or that it's something like a science. And her reasoning for this is the following. She says scientific theories, again, she kind of does this anthropological work of looking at how scientists do things. and this is her take on it. She says scientific theories stand and fall with experiments, right? You can run an empirical test to work out whether a hypothesis is confirmed or falsified by an experiment. You can't do that with philosophical theories, right? You can't wade into debates about the philosophy of perception and run an experiment and settle those debates, right? As she puts it, all the philosophical theories agree on the facts. And she worries, her worry about the ideals of logical positivists is that because philosophical theories cannot possibly adhere to the standards of empirical science, her worry is that philosophy is in danger of being declared a pseudoscience, right? So in some of her earlier writings, she says that philosophical theories have a pseudo-scientific air to them. And you can see the influence of Wittgenstein on Macdonald in that view. In her later work, she kind of responds to this issue and says, like, that is a reason to stop trying to hold philosophical inquiry up to the standards of empirical science. Instead, she embraces a comparison between philosophy and the arts. So for Macdonald, philosophy shouldn't be held to the same standards as science because it isn't one. And for Macdonald, there is a place for subjectivity or personal preference, temperament, she thinks is really important, just as there is in our engagement with the arts. So there's no view from nowhere. There's always a view from somewhere. And we should take notice of that, and it should play a role in our theorizing. We can't approach philosophical theories in a purely rational way, according to Macdonald, and we shouldn't. So again, I think she's opposed to both the descriptive and the normative version of the austere conception of philosophical inquiry. Okay, what about Emmet? When she left the philosophy department in Manchester, Emmet moved to Cambridge, and she founded a group, was one of the co-founders of a group called the Epiphany Philosophers. And the Epiphany Philosophers founded a journal which was called Theory to Theoria. And I always think that this part of the very first editorial is helpful in understanding Emmet's approach to the value of philosophical inquiry and how it ought to work. So they say to the other philosophers, to the philosophers, stop limiting philosophy and defining it in such a way as to exclude a large number of important inquiries. Okay. In her book, Rules, Roles, and Relations from the 1960s, Emmet discusses the notion of an ideal observer. As we'll find, something very similar is discussed in Murdoch's The Idea of Perfection. But the ideal observer is a notion that Emmet is borrowing from sociology. So Emmet, in Rules, Roles, and Relations, argues that moral philosophers particularly could learn a lot by doing more collaborative work with people in the social sciences. And her discussion there, I think, contains quite a clear rejection of the descriptive version of the austere view. So she writes, one who knew all the facts and consequences of all possible alternatives and was completely impartial could only be God. And I think the right way to read that is not as an endorsement of Russell's view that a good philosophical inquirer, a free intellect will see as God might see. I think instead this should be read as a reductio, right? So only God can see in a completely impartial way, and none of us are God, right? So we can't hope to see it in an impartial way. And that's consistent with Emmet's view, which is influenced by Whitehead and others, that reality is inherently something unsteady, something in flux. It's a collection of happenings, as she puts it at some point. And I mean, so Emmet at some point describes the aim of metaphysics as helping us to see life steadily. I mean, and that's partially because life and reality is not steady at all. So for Emmet, a philosophical outlook will inevitably, as she puts it, this is from her memoir, Philosophers and Friends, a philosophical outlook, any philosophical outlook will inevitably be partial and provisional and could never be fully comprehensive. So she would be critical, for example, of all the early modern philosophers who felt like they could give a systematic account of the whole of nature through whatever philosophical method. I do kind of feel obliged to add a qualification here, which is that the case of Emmet is a little bit less straightforward, attributing to her a rejection of the kind of austere view, because in Rules and Relations, she does seem to think that in certain contexts, the notion of an ideal observer, as it is understood in a sociological context, might be useful. Again, I can say more about that if that's interesting. Okay. Just to sort of bridge us from the first generation to the second generation of women. And because I think it's interesting. I think that the more I read Emmet and the more I read Midgley, the more I see interesting places of overlap. Emmet, like Midgley, maintains that philosophy must be, or at least very strongly ought to be, a collaborative enterprise. The philosophers would do very well to operate in tandem with researchers from other disciplines. Emmet, in Philosophers and Friends, says that there is no view from nowhere. Every view is a view from somewhere. And the project, which is the aim of metaphysics, of seeing life steadily, is going to require putting our different views or perspectives together, right? So she, for example, suggests that metaphysicians and theologians and physicists are all, roughly speaking, in the same game, which is the game of trying to understand life, the universe, and everything. And that if we want to kind of get a perspective on that phenomenon that is, steady, or at least steadier, then we should work alongside one another. I think, for example, there's an analogy that Midgley uses that would appeal to Emmet. So Midgley talking about how people from different disciplines should collaborate, explains that we're like individuals who have all got our own window into an aquarium, but from a particular perspective can't really work out what's in there. But if we all kind of talk to one another and explain to one another what things look like from our own individual windows into the aquarium, we can get a better picture of things. I think that really captures the spirit of Emmet's view as well. Okay. So last thing I want to do is talk about or make the case for thinking that in Murdoch and MIdgley specifically, I mean, and I would be interested to know whether people think that there are similar views in the work of Foote and Anscombe. But I think in Murdoch and MIdgley, perhaps because of the fact that they're slightly more, their careers diverge slightly from the analytic mainstream, we find a similar vision of the value and the method of philosophy as we do in Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet. So in the foreword to Murdoch's The Sovereignty of Good, Midgley writes, "Many years have passed since it first became clear to me just how far Iris Murdoch's moral outlook, along with my own, had diverged from the current ethical fashion." And I'm not trying to say that when I describe the austere view, that's exactly what Midgley and Murdoch were kind of hostile towards, but I think it's in there. I think that's part of what they're rejecting, was this austere conception of philosophical inquiry. So Murdoch, in The Idea of Perfection, talks about Stuart Hampshire's notion of the ideally rational man. So according to Murdoch, the ideally rational man is isolated from belief, from reason, and from feeling, the ultimate competent observer playing the part of the eye of God, right? So this sounds very similar to the description of the free intellect from Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. And Murdoch really takes issue with this notion of an ideal rational thinker. So Murdoch writes that man is not a combination of an impersonal, rational thinker and a personal will. Instead, she writes, he is a unified being, if you like, a kind of rounded, three-dimensional being who sees, who desires in accordance with what he sees, and who has some continual slight control over the direction of focus of his vision. So responding to the notion of the ideally rational man, Murdoch says that this picture of the inquirer is alien and implausible, right? So it's not something that is familiar, and it's also not something that's plausible, right? It just isn't how thinking, inquiring, seeing things works. I already used part of this quote from Midgley. So this is from Philosophical Plumbing, which is one of the essays in Utopias, Dolphins, and Computers. And there, right at the beginning, Midgley writes, thought is incurably powerful and explosive stuff, not safely insulated from feeling and action, but integrally linked with both of them. We think as whole people, not as disembodied minds, not as computers. So for a start, I think that this is a very similar idea of Murdoch's claim that we're unified beings, right? In both cases, it's the kind of stripping away of the things that make us human that Midgley and Murdoch are taking issue with. Stripping away of desire, maybe prejudice, education, experience, temperament, leaving behind just whatever rationality is supposed to be. That's the kind of thing that they're taking issue with. Midgley, in contrast to Russell, doesn't think of philosophy as something that elevates us beyond normal life. As is well known, she thinks the philosophical concepts are like the plumbing that lies beneath, often unnoticed, our homes and our everyday lives and our engagements and interactions with other people and so on. And like Macdonald, Midgley is quite aware of how this claim is likely to be received, right? With a sort of, that it's going to put people's noses out of joint or other philosophers' noses out of joint, but nonetheless insists that it is descriptively accurate. At the beginning of Philosophical Plumbing, she says, is philosophy like plumbing? I've made this comparison a number of times, wanting to stress that philosophizing is not just grand and elegant and difficult, it's also needed. The idea caused mild surprise and has sometimes been thought rather undignified. What about the normative reading of the austere view, right? Which is the idea that this purely rational being is an ideal that we ought to strive to emulate. I think Midgley is very, very clear in rejecting that ideal. So, for example, her would-be radio essay, Rings of Books.
Every month I've got to work that just to pay everything. Yeah. And that's before I buy food or electric or anything, you know.
Right. Thanks, Elizabeth. In Rings and Books, Midgley makes, without meaning to summarize the whole thing, makes the case for thinking that the circumstances in which philosophers live their lives inevitably affects their approach to philosophical inquiry. So she talks about philosophical bachelors and philosophical adolescents who take certain problems as important and others as trivial or basically not important at all. And the significance of that, according to MIdgley, is that philosophers isolated from what she thinks of as normal life, domestic affairs, families, children, led them to make what she calls mistakes, right? So there's, she really thinks you ought not to live in isolation from the rest of the world. So for example, it's a mistake to think that it's even plausible that the mind and the body could be distinct, as Descartes does. And he wouldn't have made that mistake if he had led what MIdgley thinks of as a normal life, right? People leading a domestic life would not, I believe, have fallen into that mistake. So for MIdgley, we ought not, very clearly ought not to separate ourselves from the conditions of ordinary life, lest we make such mistakes. Okay. Having run through, probably too quickly, the views of 5 different thinkers, what's the significance of all of this? Okay, I think there's a kind of scholarly, recovery-orientated, theoretical virtue of putting these thinkers together, right? So I think telling this wider story, as I'm attempting to do here, and as others are attempting to do and have done very successfully, has the theoretical virtue of bringing these thinkers out of isolation and obscurity. So, for example, and I think Ellie makes this point really well in her work on MIdgley, for example, the point in general being that when it comes to being remembered in philosophy's history, when it comes to being a part of the so-called canon, isolated figures tend not to fare too well. Philosophically, though, or I guess maybe meta-philosophically, I think there's something important in the fact that on the one hand, it seems obvious or trivial that we think as human beings. And on the other, that the figures who endorsed this seemingly obvious, trivial view form at best a counter tradition, right? The dominant view was a view that pushed away from this seemingly obvious, trivial claim that we think as human beings. As Stebbing and Macdonald and Emmet and Murdoch and MIdgley would all have noted, or would all have argued, perhaps, that's precisely where 20th century British philosophy went wrong. And I think what we get when we examine these figures together, perhaps as a counter tradition, is an alternative vision of philosophy's method and value, why we do it, and what we get from it. Okay, thanks very much. And thanks for listening. And I'm looking forward to thoughts and questions.